so I hope that's okay. We're recording it so other people can see it and participate at another time. But first of all, welcome again. My name's Michael Kozak. My pronouns are he, him, and I live in Boston, South Boston, actually, specifically. And I'll give my queer superhero now, and then I'll talk about her a little bit later. It is Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, and I'll talk about more about why a little bit later. But I'm also involved in XR Massachusetts, and I'm also president of Earth Day Boston. So, and been involved in the climate movement for a number of years, as well as the queer movement since I came out many years ago. So, so it's great to be here and be talking about this specific topic during Pride Month. And we're excited, and James and I were figuring out that we've basically given this presentation to about 100 other people at this point. So, so this will be a great opportunity to continue to talk about an issue that is really important to our community. So, James, do you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll have folks who are here introduce themselves?
That sounds great. Hi, everybody. I'm James Comiskey. My pronouns are he, his. I live in Somerville, Massachusetts as of like 4 months ago. I was in Boston 8 years prior to that. I am a member of Extinction Rebellion Boston, and I've been a part of the action working group there for just over 2 years now. I work at a renewable energy company outside of my activism space, and yeah, I'm really, really happy to be having this conversation with you all. Michael and I sort of stumbled upon this after a conversation that we had together about getting our friends and network more involved in the climate movement. So very happy that you are all here today.
Great.
Oh, and queer superhero. I usually go, when we've done this before, I've used Bayard Rustin as my queer superhero, but given that it's Pride Month, I have to go with Marsha P. Johnson. So.
Excellent. All right, Corinne, would you mind introducing yourself and pronouns, where you live, and queer superhero?
Hi, I'm Corinne, she, her. I live in Somerville, and my queer superhero would be Chelsea Manning for what he did for WikiLeaks. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I know Harold already introduced himself in the chat. He's from Somerville, and Alan Turing is his queer superhero. And then Sydney, would you like to introduce yourself verbally, or should we keep it just in the chat? Ah, okay, great. So she's from San Luis Obispo and Patagonia. I'm gonna need to research her a little bit. So that'll be an interesting one. And then when maybe Sachin comes back, he will have an opportunity to introduce himself. Oh,
hi. Yep.
Great.
Hi. Name, pronouns, where you live, queer superhero. Yes. Oh boy. Okay. Sachin, he, him, maybe they, not really sure. I live in Somerville. I don't know that I have a queer superhero. This is really hard.
That's okay.
So, is it cliche for me to just say like Marsha Johnson or something cliche? Like,
no, that's great. That's awesome. That's
cool. We'll go with that.
Yeah.
She's the reason we're all here, I guess. So
absolutely. Excellent. All right. Well, and it looks like someone else is coming in, but they're having some trouble with audio. So we will continue on. So James, you want to start us off with the presentation?
Great. So we're going to talk about a few things today. The purpose of this talk is to tell the truth in the climate crisis and how it affects queer communities. We'll discuss aspects of intersectionality of the climate movement. We're going to recognize the unique strengths of LGBTQ people and our skills and call upon historical movements. And then we're going to act as if the truth were real. We'll explain that a little bit at the end. So all of the information that we're about to present on climate science is from three main sources: the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You'll hear me say IPCC a couple times in this presentation, peer-reviewed research articles, and renowned scientists' opinion. We will send the slide deck out afterwards so you can scan this and see the source of information that we cut this from. So we're going to start with the basics before the specifics, and it's important that we revisit the facts as it reaffirms our work in climate and also sets the stage for what we're up against when we talk about activism and queer activism. So this might be a little bit repetitive or basic for some people, but I think it's important to talk about it. So anthropogenic, or human cause, alteration of the Earth's climate is happening through an increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These gases trap heat and cause planetary warming, and there's broad consensus in the scientific community that human activities are responsible for this. The predominant greenhouse gas causing this warming is carbon dioxide, primarily emitted from the combustion of fossil fuels. These graphs show the correlation between fossil fuel consumption, carbon concentration, and temperature anomalies since 1990. But if we zoom out over the last 800,000 years, it looks more like this. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is considered a planetary boundary parameter, meaning the consequences become extremely high risk past 350 parts per million, and past 450 is very uncertain and possibly irreversible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So who's emitting all this carbon? Well, the whole world. You can see how quickly global emissions are rising since the Industrial Revolution. You can just see the scale of the problem and how quickly this has been happening. You can see recently the uptick in emissions in developing countries, and so each country's part to play in this is massive. The United States makes up only 4.3% of the world's population, but about 15% of global emissions.
I ask a question. Sorry,
yeah, sure. Go for it.
I don't mean to derail. But that previous graph, does that include consumption and like export of production? So for example, the US exports its production to like the global south, right? So does the China and India accounts include their production that gets exported to us? Or is it counted within the US?
It includes exports. I think it's just consumption. Yeah. Good question though. So climate scientists warn that global warming of over 1.5 degrees Celsius has catastrophic consequences. A recent report from Carbon Brief estimates that in order to stay that below 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating, we would need to decrease emissions 15% a year every year since 2019. So global emissions are this thick black line here. If this peaked in 2000, a 3% annual decline, this brightest yellow line here, would have been enough to stay below 1.5 C. But today, it would need to decrease at 15% a year. For context, 15% is the decrease that we've achieved in the US in the past 12 years combined. So that needs to go from a scale of 12 years of progress to 1. And for a little bit more context and scale, emission decreases due to COVID restrictions in 2020 were about a 6% decrease globally. So puts things into perspective and scale about the massive emissions fall we'll need to see in order to hit that 1.5 degree target. When politicians talk about decarbonization by 2050, sort of highlights the joke that date is. So how much warming are we expecting? The IPCC reports model future global temperatures based on 4 different scenarios, and these are referred to as representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. These range from very optimistic to very pessimistic, and these RCPs are roughly described as the amount of heat that the Earth will absorb from the sun, depending on the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. So this is to say where we end up in terms of warming depends entirely on our global emissions levels and our ability to capture that carbon. Just to highlight a couple of examples, the RCP 2.6 pathway assumes full participation of all countries in aggressive mitigation policies, reforestation, and negative emissions technology that doesn't exist today. In that very optimistic pathway, global temperature rise is likely in the about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius range by 2100. To contrast that with the most pessimistic scenario, RCP 8.5 assumes business as usual, the absence of climate policies, and a continuation of the current trend in energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions. Global temperature rise is likely in the 4 to 5.5 degrees Celsius range by 2100. A little bit of added scary context here. These pathways were also developed in 2011. So this is actually 10 years ago from their projections. So given that I just said that, climate modeling is not easy. It's very complex. You're essentially, climate modeling, you're taking in all parameters of the entire world and trying to model what temperature rise we will be at. But there are some indications of where we are. So according to a study released in 2020 at the University of California, so far our cumulative emissions since 2005 are on path with that very pessimistic, that worst case scenario, matching within 1% of the projections. A major new study in July of 2020 by 25 leading scientists in the Review of Geophysics ruled out best case warming scenarios, but also possibly the worst case. So they're saying that the most likely band of temperature increase will be from 2.6 degrees Celsius to 3.9 degrees Celsius, putting us in the sort of pessimistic range. Kate Marble, who was one of the scientists from that study, said, "We can't rule out really, really, really wild card, catastrophic, very dangerous outcomes. That's something to keep in mind as policymakers move forward. There's a tendency to try to put the perfect number on things, to say we have 12 years to save the planet. Honestly, we have like negative 30 years to save the planet." So global temperature increase within that range is expected to have horrendous consequences within our lifetimes, ranging from catastrophic to existential. It should be on the news every day, and it should be a first priority concern of our government, but unfortunately, as we know, it is far, far from it. So we'll discuss some of the impacts of this level of climate change and how that affects queer communities in particular in the slides going forward, and I'll pass it off to Michael.
Yeah, thank you, James. So most of you probably have already heard about sea level rise as one of the consequences of continuing to emit CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And what we are already seeing is an increase in sea level rise. And in fact, this was a recent study I heard just last week that Boston, where I live and where most of us live, has experienced the most number of sunny day flooding events in the nation. So we are at high level risk already. We're experiencing these kinds of things, and I'll talk about on some of these maps here. But if we continue to go in the directions that James was just talking about, we're talking about millions, potentially billions of people who are in harm's way in terms of sea level rise all around the world. But we'll talk about specifically in the next slide some of the places where a lot of queer people live or vacation. One of the gay meccas in Provincetown, only 2 hours away from where I'm sitting right now, is going to have, if we don't change our ways, a catastrophic experience. And we'll talk about some other scenarios here, but you see in this, even if you're in this area, right where the Pilgrim Monument is, for example, which is a little higher up, sure, the Pilgrim Monument will be saved, but the downtown area, which is where all the services are, the police, the fire, the government, all that stuff, will be inundated. So, and we've already seen this in other cases. If you look at the next slide, this is just a closer up view of that map, but you can see again there are just the entire Commercial Street area almost is in danger, and most of the rest of the other parts of town. So this is serious consequences for our communities and the places where we go for regeneration. So next slide. And the Boston Globe, in the few times that they have actually addressed this issue in a serious way, recently did a report about what's already happening because of storm surges, increasing strength of storms, all those kinds of things. And this image here gives you that example. It's not just Provincetown, obviously, it's all over the Cape where buildings have been washed into the sea or had to be moved. And if you see the next slide here, there was a storm a couple of years ago, a winter storm. So most of these storms are happening during the winter, nor'easters, things like that. And this was devastating for Provincetown, both in terms of the town itself. And you can see just the example here that this boat was washed up on the jetty, but there was flooding that was going all the way through Bradford Street. And then the beach areas, the gay beach, if you will, lost a huge portion of the dunes, which is one of the things that makes it such a beautiful place to go. So we're already seeing these impacts now. If you go to the next slide. As I said, Boston is significantly at risk. And again, the places where there are significant LGBT communities are at greater risk. For example, the more recent traditional area, the South End in this graph is inundated, partially because most of that area was fill. Back Bay, similarly. You look at some of the newer areas where I live in South Boston, again, being impacted. Luckily, my specific house won't be experiencing that. But, again, even if you're not directly affected by this, the city of Boston cannot weather these kinds of flooding events. Same thing that's going on in Cambridge and other places. Next slide. Again, another major hub for LGBT people is New York City and the New Jersey area. And you can see, again, looking at 2050, huge portions of Manhattan underwater, Brooklyn. And, again, these are places where the gay community, if you look up at Chelsea, up in the northern part of this map here, again, being inundated in all of this. So next slide. And of course, Miami, South Beach, another Mecca kind of place, is completely destroyed and underwater. And large parts of Miami is, again, either threatened or underwater. And one of the problems that the South Beach area, as well as the Miami metro area, is experiencing is not only is inundation from the sea, but also inundation from below. The type of rocks that are there are limestone. And so that is allowing water to seep up through the substrate so that it's actually flooding from below as well as over top. Next slide. And what you see is, whether you look at Boston or Miami or New York, if you look at the places where LGBT people live, we are mostly at the cities and coasts, and they're 3 times more LGBTQ dense. So again, this issue is directly affecting our communities. Next slide. And as we have seen already with extreme weather events, whether it was Hurricane Sandy that hit New York and New Jersey, or I'll talk about Hurricane Katrina in a second, but we are already experiencing intensity and frequency of storms that is unprecedented. Last year, for example, the hurricane season, they ran out of names for hurricanes, right? So they had to increase and go to the Greek alphabet to name these hurricanes. So next slide.
So we'll talk a little bit more about different extreme weather events and feedback loops, and then we'll come back to the queer focused portion of the impact. So what kind of extreme weather events are we talking about? Well, sort of everything, right? Heat waves, storms and flooding, droughts and arid unlivable climates, violent storms, increased oceanic temperatures, wildfires, etc. So this visual by Carbon Brief shows the result of, they reviewed over 300 peer-reviewed studies and determined whether human activity is predicted to make these kinds of events more severe, and that is indicated in red. So as you can see, the answer is an overwhelming yes, that besides cold and snow, perhaps, events, all of these weather events become more extreme based on human influence. I think those may be more well-known impacts of climate change, but a result of warmer climate that I don't think gets discussed enough is that it increases the chances of simultaneous crop failure in countries where production is dominating. It also affects the nutritional quality of vegetables and legumes, and it also increases CO2 levels, increased CO2 levels alter the protein and micronutrients and vitamin content of rice and grains. So worsening climate change means food scarcity and literally less nutritious food. And we'll talk about why that's important to queer communities in a few slides. It may be comforting to think that climate repercussions are linearly correlated with emissions. So if you do X amount of warming, you get Y amount of temperature increase, storms, etc. But it's not always that simple. Feedback loops are a critical reason why it's not that simple and why controlling the climate crisis becomes increasingly harder. A feedback loop happens when an effect of a warming planet can itself cause additional warming. So there are a few examples of this that we might be familiar with. So Arctic sea ice. As the planet warms, Arctic sea ice melts. As the ice melts, it turns from a white surface, a reflective surface, to a dark surface that absorbs more heat. That's called the albedo effect. So as the ice caps melt, it actually traps more heat because it is now a darker surface. Another example of that is wildfires. So as temperatures increase, we're more likely to see natural wildfires. The more wildfires we see, the more carbon's emitted into the air, and it's sort of this cyclical nature. A scary example was permafrost, perhaps a less well-known one. Permafrost is essentially frozen ground. There's a lot of permafrost in where the poles are on the planet. And this is a quote by G. Whiteman. So the global warming triggered by the massive release of carbon dioxide may be catastrophic, but the subsequent release of permafrost methane may be apocalyptic. There's also, I just was reading something this week about how in that permafrost, which can have been frozen for hundreds of years, there can also be new viruses that have not been, that have been laying dormant for hundreds of thousands of years. So that's comforting to know too. So this domino effect of the feedback loops, those are just a few examples, but there are others. They can trigger one another. So a domino-like cascade of melting ice, warming seas, and dying forests could tilt the Earth into a hothouse state beyond which human efforts to reduce emissions will become increasingly futile. I'll pass it back to Michael to talk about how that compounds for queer communities.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, we are at a higher risk for impacts of these kinds of events. If you hit the button there, whether it's the general LGBT youth population, which is about 7% homeless, about 40% of the homeless population is LGBT youth. So when you see folks who are unhoused, how are they going to experience these kinds of events, right? It's much more intense. 100-degree day, if you can't go into air conditioning, is way more impactful than if you can. Next part. And then the non-LGBT community is about 17% food insecure, but 27% of the LGBT population is food insecure. So if we're talking about these issues that James was talking about in terms of food quality, food availability, nutrition, all of that kind of stuff, again, our community is further impacted by this. Next piece. And contrary to prevailing ideas about a wealthy community, things like that, the LGBT poverty rate is 22% versus 16% for cis straight folks. So again, if you do not have the resources to, for example, move or protect yourself from high levels of heat, or, for example, the kind of wildfires that James was talking about that enveloped San Francisco last year, for example. Think about that LGBT homeless youth out there who was having to, deal with that kind of just horrible air quality, right? So again, these are compounding issues for our community on top of what is already happening and going to continue to happen if we don't shift the systems. Next slide. Oh, and one other point about that before we move on to these social political institutions, and this is where I wanted to come back to this issue of Hurricane Katrina. For example, trans folks were turned away from shelters during that event in 2005. And poverty amongst trans women is almost 30%, 29.4%. And for Black LGBT adults, it's 30.8%. So again, if you have an LGBT identity plus issues related to homelessness, poverty, food insecurity, and then you, on top of that, are non-white, then you have compounding issue on top of compounding issue, and you are more vulnerable to all these things that we're talking about here. And then there are also social political implications. And I think we're already seeing this here. And I'll talk about that in a second, but here's the quote. There are high levels of public unrest and political destabilization due to increasing climate pressures, resulting in some countries becoming dysfunctional. Theodor Adorno, a German philosopher, said that fear and destructiveness are the major sources of fascism. That the 15th IPCC special report published in 2018 describes possible global social political scenarios resulting from the application of mitigation policies to different degrees. The report states there are high levels of public unrest and political destabilization. These conditions constitute a breeding ground for authoritarianism, fascism, and totalitarianism. And as I said, I think some of this is already showing up. One of the things that we have been facing and we've been seeing on the news is huge migrations from Central America up to the southern border of the United States. While the news is covering that issue, they're not making the climate connections. You know, for example, again, Central America was hit with 2 hurricanes in roughly the same area within a couple of months. Issues of heat and other climate changes are causing folks to lose their farms and not have a livelihood. And again, they're moving to find another place. And all of those, that migration issue is leading to things like, for example, our previous president whipping up fear about migration to gain supporters, political power, things like that. And of course, within those migrants, there's LGBT communities in those migration patterns. Next slide. And the sad part is, in all of this, and many parts of it are sad, but this is the thing that can be shocking on top of shock, that the richest 10% are causing 50% of the emissions that are out there. But the poorest are only causing about 10%, and yet they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. And this, you know, has been repeated. We see this with the pandemic that we are still going through, but Massachusetts is kind of getting onto the other side. But you know, you saw people kind of escaping the pandemic. Some of the richest people are going on their yachts and not you know, concerned about social distancing. And in the process, they're also creating more emissions in the climate crisis. So again, the wealthiest are creating the most emissions, but having the least effects, and also experiencing, have the most resources to protect themselves. Next slide. And then again, if you look at the ways in which folks are impacted by this, it is disproportionate. If you look at just what is happening right here in Boston, Asian American residents are at a 26% higher exposure than the state average to air pollution. And all of that, of course, is related to climate change as well. African American residents have a 24% higher exposure, and Latino residents have a 17% higher exposure. And again, making those connections. The LGBT community is Asian American, African American, Latino, multiracial. We're representative of the entire society. So again, these are compounding issues for LGBT folks of color. Next slide. And there are other ecological pressures on our planet. If you hit the next one, we're talking about issues related to water pollution, plastic pollution, deforestation, ocean acidification. And I'll just take one example there with ocean acidification. Our economy here in Massachusetts, a huge percentage of it is based in the fishing industry, and in particular lobsters and other shellfish, things like that. As acidification increases, that creates shells that are unable to sustain their life. And then what we're already seeing is, for example, the lobster population, because the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any other body of water on the planet. These lobsters are already moving up north. So again, we have issues for our economy and issues for food. So, and as we know, biodiversity loss is increasing. And what many scientists are worried about is the sixth mass extinction. So 60% of wildlife populations have already been destroyed since 1970. 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. This exceptionally rapid loss of biodiversity of the last few centuries indicates that a sixth mass extinction is already underway. And I want to emphasize this, that this would be the first human-caused mass extinction. And to think about us human beings having that level of impact on our planet is just staggering.
So, wow, we just threw a lot at you, we know. And that can be hard to hear. And I do promise that in the next part of the presentation, we're going to talk more about activism and sort of the what to do part of all of this. But I just, it is some of us may know all that information, and some of that might have been new to some people. Hopefully it was. And it can be a lot to hear at once. So we want to just sort of create the space and say that grief is welcome here. We're about, to turn this into the positives I mentioned, but we want to allow people to reflect before doing so. And I'd like to read a quote that I like by Kate Marvel, the same scientist that we quoted earlier, the NASA scientist. She says, "To be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow motion horror story. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope, but the problem is I don't have any. However, the opposite of hope is not despair, it is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn, and here the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together, broken hearts trapped under a warming atmosphere. We need courage and not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness, and we are not worth less for it." And I love this part. "Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending." So before we talk a little bit about activism, we'll just quickly mention the sort of need for activism. So why do we need it? Well, look how embedded the problem is in our government. And no, I don't just mean the previous 4 years. Crude oil production jumped 72% while Obama was in office. And that turned the US into the first oil producer in the world over Russia and Saudi Arabia. Additionally, the amount of fracked gas production and fossil fuel exports during that period expanded dramatically. In 2015, the US was the second largest subsidizer of fossil fuels in the world at $649 billion. And as we mentioned earlier, Biden in his climate summit this year made a non-binding commitment to decarbonization by 2050. So, given the information you just heard, that timeline is supremely inefficient. We need to elect climate leaders and not just politicians that will be bought off by special interests in both parties or make incremental change. The kind of change we need is systemic, massive scale, and no political party certainly, not the one we see the previous 4 years, or administration has introduced this change. And there have been some very committed international communities that have devoted decade-long efforts to address the climate crisis, which have manifested as either intergovernmental institutions, as the one we see here, or as the ones in the bottom, non-governmental organizations that have international outreach. These organizations have undeniably contributed to raise public awareness on the topic, and to a certain extent, they have succeeded and served as a counteracting force to systemic environmental destruction. But basic data on carbon pollution on the scale here, and the time scale, reveals that the power of mainstream economic and political interests has still overruled all attempts to mitigate that crisis. These methods have proven insufficient to reverse the current trend in degradation, and thus environmental movements have no choice but to escalate their tactics if real effectiveness is to be attained. So what is the appropriate social response then? Government inaction on climate change constitutes a fundamental breach of what's called the social contract, which is based on theories of Hobbes and Locke. It recognizes the right of rebellion, which is the right and duty of people of a nation to override a government that acts against their common interest or threatens the safety of the people without cause. It was a founding principle of the Declaration of Independence, as the following excerpt highlights: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So the near-term catastrophic effects of climate change, combined with the aforementioned institutional incompetence, constitutes a clear example of governments no longer being able to guarantee the safety and happiness of its people. So enter stage right, Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion seeks to take up the right and duty to rebel. It is a global movement of nonviolent civil disobedience whose mission is creating sustainable societies that hand a livable future to generations to come. It was started in the UK and is now now has chapters all over the world, but these are just a highlight of some of the chapters here in the US. Extinction Rebellion has 4 main demands. The first is to tell the truth. So for governments and media to properly inform the public, as we have just seen in this presentation, for example, about the climate crisis, to not just mention it for 3 minutes in a debate and move on from it. People need to know the truth. When people know the truth, then we act on it. And so Extinction Rebellion demands that we hit net zero emissions by 2025. Sounds extremely aggressive, and it is. But if you don't have goals to swing to, then where are we swinging to? If we need to decarbonize by 2028 globally, then the United States, with all of its economic power, needs to be one of the countries that are doing that more aggressively. So we think 2025 is the right scientific-based target. Number 3 is a citizens' assembly. So we don't trust the government to do this on their own. It must be essentially a randomly selected, almost like a jury, group of people that can assist with making these decisions and involves the people of the country to oversee these changes. And the 4th one, which is a unique one to the United States, is a just transition, meaning prioritizing marginalized communities, as we mentioned earlier, that contribute the least to climate change but feel the worst effects. So when we're speaking about citizens' assemblies and representation and policies that prioritize marginalized communities, queer and BIPOC people must be a part of that conversation. And if we're not, we run the risk of not having our voices and our experiences and our perspectives heard, or policies being put in place that continue to not address the climate justice disparities in queer communities and BIPOC communities. At the same time, we must also be a voice for members of our community that maybe don't have the social liberty to dedicate time to this movement because of what Michael was talking about earlier. It's essential to have queer representation in a climate movement, or really any social movement for that matter. Extinction Rebellion has 10 principles that we abide by when we're acting in the name of the organization. We won't go over them, but it is important to highlight nonviolence. So nonviolence, Extinction Rebellion strictly adheres to nonviolence as a quality of all of its actions, and that's for 2 main reasons. One is it's morally correct, and the second is that it's effective. On the moral piece, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. it's inherent to the morality of a movement that seeks to protect life to be nonviolent. And as for the effectiveness piece, nonviolent resistance can effectively challenge democratic and non-democratic opponents more so than violent resistance. So this study from 2008 systematically explored violent and nonviolent campaigns in conflicts between 1900 and 2006, concluding that nonviolent movements roughly doubled their chances of total or partial success over violent ones, while their chances of failure were systematically halved. Additionally, a report was released in 2017 by Erica Chenoweth that used historical data from over 300 revolutions or campaigns to show that every campaign that got active participation from at least 3.5% of a population succeeded, and many succeeded with less. So an interesting study about the amount of people that need to actually be actively engaged and mobilized in order to affect change. There's a lot of nuance involved with that. You know, obviously, if the public is not more or less in favor of that change, you know, you can't just be the only 3.5% in a population that thinks that. But sort of an encouraging statistic that to get people more involved. But we knew that, right? We know nonviolent civil disobedience, which I'll call NVCD, works. We've seen examples in the US of success of disobedient campaigns. So civil disobedience is a general term for the public and conscientious breaking of the law, a refusal of commands or demands of a government. Those participating in it must be willing to accept the legal consequences, whatever they may be, for the type of disobedience that you're participating in. And we've seen it work before in slavery. So Henry David Thoreau's withholding of tax money to protest the Mexican-American War and institutional slavery in the 1840s. In women's rights, the women's suffrage included marches, picketing, silent vigils, and hunger strikes in the 19th century. And Rosa Parks and the Freedom Riders' refusal to give bus seats and restaurant sit-ins during the civil rights movement of the 1950s. A couple quotes here. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good, by Martin Luther King Jr. And by Thoreau, it costs me less in every sense to incur the penalty of disobedience to the state than it would to obey. So the mechanism and sort of how that works is it's NVCD works best when you reach people, and you reach people through direct action. Actions and protests are viewed by participants of the action and their networks, also bystanders that happen by the action, and by media viewers. So this increases public awareness and urgency of the issue that the participants are there for, increasing the likelihood for media to cover the issue appropriately and factually, and thus further increasing the urgency. That increases political pressure to act on the issue, and by forcing the government and media to tell the truth and inform the public, and then by effect, having the public put pressure back on those institutions to take action. That's how we win our demands in the social movement. Civil disobedience, so this disruption, needs to be anything but humdrum in order for that to be effective. Drama, humor, gravity, and joy are all elements of effective and emotional disruption that captures people's attention and media attention. So looking at these types of effective emotions in activism, to me, these just scream queer talent. On the top line are all pictures from previous Extinction Rebellion actions, and the bottom line are some analogous examples of queer activism. On the bottom left is an example of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. I don't know if people have seen them. They are trans nuns, they're queer nuns. And the quote from their website says, "We use humor and irreverent wit to expose the forces of bigotry, complacency, and guilt that chain the human spirit." And I think that's just beautiful, and speaks to the sort of emotions that we're hoping to portray. In addition to different emotions involved in effective disruption, there's also different types of targets. So there's, you can just engage in general disruption, which is disruption for the sake of disruption, like roadblocks. You can have targeted disruption, so a specific site like fossil fuel site or a corporation or a government facility. There's creative visioning, so disruption that in itself portrays sort of a vision of the future or creative spectacle that we want to see. An example of that is guerrilla gardening in spaces, or if people saw the Citgo action from last year, you know, instead of having a giant fossil fuel advertisement, we can have a beautiful, much more beautiful message and sign above the streets in Boston. So that's creative visioning. So, you know, emotion and connection is where queer people have expertise. We've been living and organizing like this for decades. Here are just some pictures from actions that XR Boston has put on the past 2 years. These actions, you know, just from the pictures alone, carry a lot of emotion with them, and it works. We have succeeded in getting media attention and public awareness to the climate crisis via these actions. And while that's hard to measure, the education and the pressure pushes the needle on social issues and helps achieve our demands, as we mentioned previously. It's not anything new to the queer community. So Michael is going to talk a bit how queer communities have used these kinds of tactics in the past, and we'll call upon those movements to inspire us.
Yes, and as James was talking about, this is kind of the good part, right? Here's the part where the LGBT community has in the past done amazing things to wake up society to needs that the government is not addressing, and helps us think about our own power that we have and our historical power that we were able to generate through these kinds of creative disruption, nonviolent civil disobedience. So for example, here, the suffrage movement, one of the most important movements of the 20th century, giving women half our population the right to vote, right? It was a long period starting with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others back in 1848. But from the beginning, as Susan Ware says, these kinds of non-heteronormative relationships were just part and parcel of the suffrage movement. So Susan B. Anthony, later on in her life, had a relationship with a woman. Carrie Chapman Catt, again, another major figure in the suffrage movement, again, spent a long part of her life in a relationship with a woman. Alice Dunbar Nelson, who in her diary described a thriving lesbian and bisexual subculture among Black suffragists and club women. And, you know, not only were queer women a major part of the movement, but they were a major part of these kinds of mass public protests, as you see. One of the most famous ones were called the Silent Sentinels, standing in front of the White House, getting President Wilson to think about and again bring public pressure and attention to this idea that while the United States was fighting for liberty abroad, it wasn't giving half of its population here at home their liberty, right? So next slide. And of course, as I mentioned, one of my queer heroes here, Rachel Carson, again, she woke up the population in 1962 with Silent Spring, becoming a major media figure. Even though she didn't want to be a major media figure, she created a uprising among the pesticides industry over her book. So just a book, she then became a target. But her message came through, and eventually we were able to get past the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the banning of DDT, which is one of the major issues she was talking about, and eventually the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s. Next slide. And of course, another hero that James has mentioned earlier, Bayard Rustin, was a major player in the African-American civil rights movement. As you can see from this image on the left, he was the organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. His efforts were so important to the movement that when other figures of the civil rights movement were trying to get him removed from the organizing committee because of them finding out of his gay identity, Martin Luther King said no and resisted that and maintained his leading role in organizing the March on Washington. And then on the right, what you see is his relationship with another man later on in his life, but the two of them were very much involved in organizing around the HIV and AIDS crisis, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Well, two after that, actually. So I can't skip Stonewall, right? It is Pride, and we are celebrating this event. And again, group of people who were not being listened to, who police were arresting. As you see in this, in the image on the right here, this is actually Marsha P. Johnson in the fur. She and others were just not going to take it anymore. And through this, the Stonewall riots, but then the marches afterwards created this second wave of the LGBT rights movement. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we've been here before around these issues where, again, the government is not paying attention to us, letting us die, and the organization ACT UP was formed to call attention to, through mass public protests and creative ways. I remember one of their most famous protests was when they brought condoms to the Catholic Church, which was the major Catholic church in New York City, and came into that church, and that made national news. And then in the 90s, I was part of this organization called Queer Nation, and we would do many creative types of public protests, kiss-ins in malls, and these places that queer people aren't supposed to be. Well, we went there and were visible about all of this. So again, these are ways in which the LGBT community has woken society up when society wasn't listening, and achieved major things. And while the AIDS crisis is not over, the ACT UP was able to, A, get the media to pay attention to this, but B, through advocating around the FDA, they were able to get treatment options. And now there are basic preventative measures like PrEP and other things to protect people. So next slide. And just an example, again, of the hope that can be created by activism. Greta Thunberg, one young person in Sweden, by striking for the climate, by standing in front of the Stockholm, Swedish parliament in Stockholm, created a movement to the point where right before the pandemic started in 2019, in September 19, 8,000 people showed up at Boston City Hall, and millions of people around the world to support action on the climate crisis. And so it's not about age, race, religion, whatever it is. Everybody can have a voice in this movement, and should have a voice in this movement. So if you're not ready to do something like Greta Thunberg, there are other ways to participate in the movement. Obviously, we would love you to participate through Extinction Rebellion, but there's youth groups like Sunrise, 350 Mass, 350 National are organizations that you can join and participate either in other kinds of street actions or other kinds of actions. But another important thing is through personal choice. Becoming either a vegetarian or vegan, or at least reduce your meat and fish consumption to 2 times per week, can be an essential part of reducing your own impact on the climate. And then encouraging people to switch to renewable energy, either do it yourself or encouraging others. Solar is a great way, but you can also do wind through something called Community Choice Energy. In Boston, there is an easy way to do it, where the city of Boston has created just a link where you can just shift your energy source to 100% renewable. Obviously, elections are important, and both in terms of setting the tone, but also creating the actions that we are hoping for here. And that's important. We have an election in Boston coming up this September, the primary, and then November, the general election, and thinking about who understands this issue and will move it forward in the ways that it needs to be moved forward. And then these other things, reducing your transportation emissions can be essential. As we saw during this pandemic, walking, biking, being outside is great, not only for the planet, but great for your mental health and physical health. And as people are getting back onto the roads, it's important that we use public transport more, or if you have to drive, find a way to get at least a car that gets 35 miles to the gallon, or shifting to electric in the next purchase that you make. And then finally, plastics are part of this. Plastics are filled with petroleum, and not only are plastics just the environmental catastrophe in our oceans as well as on land, but they are a source of profits for these fossil fuel companies and consumption of fossil fuels. So next. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
So yeah, so we'll email the slides out from the presentation, and I'll add, you'll get the email from me, and I'll put Michael's email on CC there, so you have both of these. But please email us if you want to get involved, or if you're not already plugged in with Extinction Rebellion. If you go to xrmass.org/welcome, there's a lot of links there to kind of help get you started. It's not just asking people to perform civil disobedience. You don't need to sign up for that in any way if you're not ready for that. We need all talent. We have people in the group that make art for the actions, or are musicians, or just help with the infrastructure pieces, just the planning part. So there's plenty of ways to get involved and be creative in this. So please get in touch if you want to. And so just to make some final comments, it is true that the queer community is a marginalized community that faces compounding issues with the climate crisis. It is also simultaneously true that the queer community is a creative and bright and experienced community, a strong community that has faced adversity and won before. The queer community understands solidarity and intersectionality. The queer community is an emotional one that evokes emotion through their skills. Civil disobedience and social justice is in queer DNA. And so what we meant in the beginning of the presentation of to know the truth and act like the truth were real is what we mean now. So to do something about it. It might sound like a silly phrase to say, it's to act as if the truth were real, but it's not what has been happening. So it needs to sort of be stated in that way. So thank you so much everyone for coming. Michael and I would love to hear people's thoughts, ideas, and conversations about queer activism. Feel free to stick around and share your experiences or thoughts or feedback on the presentation if you'd like. Otherwise, if you have to jump, we're just over 8 o'clock. So thanks again for coming, and we'll hope to talk to you or see you again soon, and happy Pride.